Before I'm absolutely obliterated and the dislike button gets blown out of the water, let me first say that Game of Thrones, even as early on as Season 5, has had some serious issues with the writing. I know it's been a hard pill to swallow that Season 6 wasn't all what it was cracked up to be, but the same even applies to Season 5, albeit to a smaller extent. So I wanted to go in depth and analyze the devoid of logic aspects of the season, big and small. This will probably be a long video, but relax, grab a nice skull of wine, and let's dive into Season 5 being devoid of logic. So right away for the opening flashback for Cersei's prophecy of only having 3 children, I find it funny how contradictory David and Dan's philosophy for writing is. Because in Season 6 they say this:
when we started working on the show, we did not want to do flashbacks because oftentimes it seems like a hallmark of kind of lazy storytelling.
But I guess they forgot they used a flashback to open this season. And to me, as long as flashbacks don't have redundant information and could otherwise be expressed through more nuanced writing or dialogue, then I think flashbacks are fine. Also, I'm not sure if David and Dan forgot another thing in which Cersei has a dialogue scene with Catelyn in Season 1, where she tells her that her firstborn child with Robert dies from a fever. Which this would inherently contradict the prophecy of having 3 kids, and is a clear mistake on the writing front. I've seen people defend this as Cersei lying, but there's no clear evidence of her lying in this scene, and she gives a pretty detailed account of the event. From here, Tyrion arrives at Illyrio's palace. For this point, it feels kind of weird that David and Dan choose to not bring back Illyrio, given that he was a pretty prominent player in Season 1. He directly influenced the fates of Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen, and even conspired with Varys in King's Landing. So by not including him, you're essentially deflating the story by subtracting characters from the narrative that would otherwise add more depth and interesting dynamics. This isn't a massive deal, and the story is still able to function, but to me, it seems like a fundamental downgrade and is an example of lazy writing in which David and Dan didn't feel like writing him back into the story when he should have been. Moving over to Brienne of Tarth, like most of the plotlines in this season, her journey is pretty much original. As an example, she never runs into Arya or Sansa in the books. So you may know where I'm going with this, in that it's pretty fucking lucky that Brienne runs into both Arya and Sansa within a few episodes. The fact that David and Dan leave this completely up to chance I think is abysmal writing, and forces the audience to fundamentally accept a glaring contrivance within the narrative, instead of, you know, writing a more logical plot in which Brienne conducts an investigation and interrogates different witnesses for information. Her plan in the show instead consists of hoping she miraculously and randomly runs into Arya or Sansa around the general vicinity of certain areas, which also makes this entire plotline sleep-inducing because she's doing nothing but sitting around and waiting for something to happen. And the crazy thing here is that, at least for the opening of Season 5, she's not even on the King's Road and Sansa happens to just ride right by her.
A few days' ride from the King's Road.
God, this just drives me wild, and writing the story in this manner makes the world feel tiny when it used to be massive and expansive. In the broader context of the narrative, Brienne achieving her goal of finding Arya and Sansa is practically impossible, but at the very least, David and Dan could have written it in a manner that actually attempted to be based in logic. Tywin's post-funeral gathering is buzzing, and look, it's our old pal Lancel Lannister. I briefly went into the upcoming issue in the villain ranking video, but I'll expand upon it here. So to say this first, I love how David and Dan condemn using flashbacks as a bad form of writing, but yet they have an entire off-screen major development for this character in joining the faith. Now, most people don't care about Lancel as a character. However, given that he had a reoccurring presence in the first 2 seasons, it's undeniably jarring when he flat out disappears for 2 whole seasons and then suddenly comes back in Season 5 as a completely changed character. Again, going back to the lazy writing point and David and Dan choosing to not develop certain characters. The same thing also applies to Bran, since David and Dan decided to hit pause on his subplot and hit resume in Season 6. Presumably for Lancel though, he's been in King's Landing this whole time given that he's with the Faith now, and it's really weird that we haven't seen him. According to the show's wiki, his wound festered and he had to battle that sickness for months, but I don't remember him ever saying that. So I'm not sure where they got that information, and overall, this is a jarring point in the writing, and David and Dan don't alleviate this issue with giving us a tangible reason as to why he's been MIA for so long. Returning to the whole Brienne conundrum, she runs into Sansa and Littlefinger at an inn. She decides to try to convince Sansa that she's loyal to her, but she's really bad at convincing people. Like her saying that a shadow killed Renly instead of vaguely saying an assassin did, and her not defending herself and that her saving Catelyn was impossible. So she essentially just shoots her a shot here, and it makes me wonder if there wasn't a better way forward instead of blitzing into the situation with fighting in mind. If she really wanted to do that, then it probably would have made more sense to ambush them at night or something. That end, it doesn't really make sense as to why this devolves into an action scene. Littlefinger insists that Brienne stay for the night, which may be insinuating that he wants to kill her, but I don't understand why he really cares and doesn't let her go, along with Brienne just immediately running away in a hostile fashion. Because of this, it comes across as David and Dan wanting to inject an artificial action scene that doesn't have a strong justification. And it's not like it was even a good action scene to begin with. One tiny nitpick here is Brienne having enough strength to break through a sword while holding the blade with a single hand while in a sitting position. It is Valyrian steel, but that would still probably require quite a bit of strength. Now we arrive at the infamous beginning of the Dorne plotline. The whole devoid of logic aura that permeates from the subplot is the fact that Jaime actually thinks he has the ability to save Myrcella. Like he deadass has to infiltrate an entire nation, city, royal castle, and exfiltrate a high-value target through hostile territory, all while covertly sneaking past hundreds of guards and hoping that no one notices Myrcella's absence because the entire city would go into lockdown. The probability of something going wrong is so absurdly high that I'm surprised he even sets out on this journey to begin with. It essentially means his certain death, along with the fact that he can't fight, so any kind of combat would also most likely get him killed. Oh, what's that? One of his fight scenes later on he survives because of literal luck?
Nice move. Luck.
Like, pfft. This plotline is instantly cursed to fail from the get-go, and anyone tasked with writing this is going to have a hard time. It's fundamentally a terrible direction to take the story. So, naturally from this point, Jaime goes to Bronn, which does make some sense, and I think is a logical pairing if Jaime was so hell-bent on wanting to go on this mission. Daario has wall hacks, Qyburn takes a head for his future lunch, and Tyrion and Varys start their lovely bickering romance. Arya arrives to the House of Black and White, and this episode's conflict for her where they don't let her in is very confusing. It would make sense if she had to overcome some kind of obstacle or pass a test, but Arya literally just waits around for an entire day, kills a pigeon, and when she's about to get jumped, Jaqen shows up to save her and lets her in. Nothing happens in the story, and it feels like this only wastes time. Like, what was the point of all this? Why didn't he let her in? What did she do that changed his mind? I don't know, this is just a very off-putting start to the Faceless Assassin arc, and it doesn't make sense as to why Jaqen didn't force Arya to shed her personality in this scene so that she could come in and be no one, instead of doing that later and allowing Arya Stark to remain as herself. Narratively, that feels the best, and the way it is currently is puzzling in terms of its execution. Episode 3, here we come, baby. Tommen has some very engaging dialogue with Marjorie after nutting.
Do you like to sail?
I love to sail.
I do too.
Arya realizes she's in a boring cult, and oh yeah, this is where Littlefinger's character gets assassinated by David and Dan. Which, since we're opening up this literal can of worms, I may as well condense all of Littlefinger's screen time within Season 5, since it's so hard to follow. Or it's not like it really helps, since it's still hard to follow watching them all at once anyways. So the reason why this whole plot point is painfully devoid of logic is that Littlefinger loves Sansa, and she's essentially his prized possession. He would never betray her because, on top of his infatuation, she's arguably the most important character in the narrative given that she's the key to the North. So alienating her by surprising her and throwing away to the Boltons is absolutely insane. Let alone going to the Boltons and not Stannis Baratheon. Like, literally everyone in the North hates the Boltons, so going to them instead of Stannis, when they have a smaller army, and a significantly worse reputation since they kind of massacred the Starks, is wild. In this regard, it feels like David and Dan throw out all logic in the narrative, so that they can instill drama into this plotline by tossing Sansa into this Bolton Theon Caesar salad. That and Littlefinger never acts on a plan without concrete information, and the fact that he doesn't know Ramsay is a psychopath is another ridiculous aspect for this plot point. Ramsay publicly flays members of houses alive if they don't pay their taxes, as he reveals in this dialogue scene.
Lord Perwyn refused to pay.
I flayed him living, along with his wife and brother. Made his son watch.
He's literally spreading fear throughout the North, and somehow, Littlefinger has never heard of him. Like, that's a pretty major intellectual downgrade for Littlefinger as a character, let alone him deciding that this is a good idea. Later on, Littlefinger reveals that he wants Sansa to be in Winterfell once Stannis inevitably wins. His reasoning being, Stannis would make her Wardeness of the North. And if that's actually his goal, then I really don't understand why he isn't allying with Stannis. Like, that would be a guaranteed victory if Stannis actually had a strong, disciplined, and competent army that wasn't composed of sellswords. Also, it's not like the Boltons are doing anything for Littlefinger. His involvement with the Boltons actually introduces more conflict in the Vale when Lord Royce figures out what happened to Sansa. So none of this makes any sense, and then David and Dan decide to add a thick layer of dog shit icing onto this garbage logic of a cake, and sending Littlefinger to King's Landing to talk to Cersei. During this scene, the convoluted nature essentially doubles and makes his plan even more incoherent. He essentially offers to take the Vale and kill whoever the victor is after the Battle of Winterfell, and in return, Cersei will make him Warden of the North. However, she demands Sansa's head, so this just renders this entire scene as a waste of time, because we know none of this will happen.
I'll not rest until the lion flies over Winterfell.
Okay.
So why did Littlefinger bother to go all the way down to King's Landing? I don't know. I guess David and Dan were desperate to pad out time in the season with nonsensical dialogue scenes that make your brain cells want to commit seppuku. So yeah, that's the Littlefinger debacle, and I think this singular clip of Dan Weiss talking about Littlefinger's character explains everything.
He's doing something completely unexpected, something that has a sense of motivation behind it, but there's no way to tell what his real motivation is until you get to the end of the scene and you realize his real motivation is what Littlefinger's motivation always is, which is furthering the naked self-interest of Littlefinger.
These bozos simply weren't smart enough to write his character, while also using him as a conduit to channel their dogshit story directions that in turn utterly compromised his character. This is by far the first point in the story that is the most damaging to the overall quality of the show. I can probably go into more detail about the scenes in season 5, but I don't want to induce a state of you zoning out from how convoluted and nonsensical his plan was in season 5. And the funny thing is, he literally disappears after this because David and Dan failed so horribly with his character and don't decide to write anything else that's interesting for him. I wish I was paid David and Dan's salary to flat out not do my job. Then for the ending of the episode where Ser Jorah kidnaps Tyrion, I initially thought this was a major coincidence, but it's much more believable for this to happen as opposed to Brienne running into both Stark daughters while out in the country. At least here it's more plausible to run into people in actual cities. It is also kind of silly how there's conveniently this person docking a boat out in the middle of nowhere with no witnesses, but this is immediately made up for by him eating Tyrion's body. Oh, we're in episode 4. Okay, cool.
He murdered my father. If I ever see him, I'll split him in two.
Sure. Cersei gets rid of Mace Tyrell, which is an utter tragedy. Cersei weaponizes religious maniacs without understanding why they were disarmed in the past in the first place. Tommen puts in maximum effort to try to get back Sir Loras, and Ollie misses out on Melisandre seducing Jon Snow. In this scene, Melisandre says this:
"You know nothing, Jon Snow."
This essentially opens up a lot of questions that are never answered for the whole magic side of the show, and I guess Melisandre low-key has the ability to talk to the dead or something. I don't know, there's just a lot of mystical shit surrounding the Lord of Light that goes unexplained, and it feels like David and Dan only throw in this line to make her spookier and more mysterious. At the end of episode 4, there's the infamous death of Sir Barristan Selmy. Now, logically, this death makes sense in that any scenario where you're greatly outnumbered and get rushed by multiple people, it's impossible to fight them all at once. Skill basically goes out the window because you physically can't stop being swarmed. I've seen people argue that it was dumb that Sir Barristan couldn't solo everyone in this room because he's one of the best fighters, but that would have been absurd if that was the case. However, the issue in the writing arises in the fact that you're killing off a big character for practically no reason other than for brief entertainment value. All this death achieves is making the Sons of the Harpy a more impactful villain force, but you can still achieve that without killing a major character. And the reason why this death is a fundamental issue is that Sir Barristan dying later on in the narrative would have greatly fueled Dany's plunge into the Mad Queen arc. and thus give this character a more meaningful death. That, and this may be an unpopular opinion, but I think it's pretty cheap that David act all, oh, anyone can still die, but then Grey Worm miraculously survives. Which I do want to happen, however, David and Dan place Grey Worm into a scenario where he should have also died. Rewatching the scene, there are a lot of moments that highlight how contrived this scene is. Like Sons of the Harpy members immediately rushing and grabbing Unsullied, but when it comes to our heroes, they stagger around in the background when they can easily get in cheap shots from behind. There are also 2 shots where Sons of the Harpy members ignore Grey Worm and walk right past him, and he's even able to impale one of them with the blunt end of his spear. Along with the scene being riddled with continuity errors, like in this shot, we see Grey Worm fighting 2 people, and then in the next one, he's suddenly fighting 4. Like, the scene is just ridiculous, and I think David and Dan panicked that the drama they're writing was nowhere near as good as the earlier seasons. So they wanted to jack up the ratings by throwing in a shocking action scene, when in reality, the scene on retrospect is especially terrible. Oh boy, we're at the halfway mark, and episode 5 just barely skates by with no major writing flaws, and the only thing that stood out to me was Brienne's message to Sansa. In the message she relays, she tells Sansa that if she's in trouble, light a candle in the broken tower. But like, what is Brienne gonna do? Rush Winterfell and solo all the Boltons, or somehow scale over the walls? What is she going to realistically do in this scenario to save Sansa from Winterfell? It's just a minor point that never comes to fruition since Brienne kind of becomes preoccupied later on, but the practicality of this situation doesn't make sense to me. On to episode 6, and this is the real problem child of the season. Arya's whole progression with the Faceless Assassins is so inconsistent and random that it feels like David and Dan are using a plot generator to determine where the story goes. Because in this episode, Arya literally fails her test with Jaqen, and then in her next scene, she lies to this random girl, and that's apparently enough to grant her access to the Hall of Faces. This feels so unearned given that Arya has practically accomplished nothing and has constantly been failing her assignments. But one minor success allows her to move up a tier in this organization. That just doesn't make sense to me, and this reveal seems as if David and Dan are jumping the gun. Which this isn't to say that I want the subplot to be even slower, but to instead have an actual plot progression in which a character earns her position in place of power. We may as well just have skipped all these nonsense chores because this doesn't test Arya. The reconnaissance and actual field work is what tests her and proves herself to the Faceless Assassins. From there, it would make sense to earn her way into the Hall of Faces as she's tasked with finally killing someone. But I don't know, I guess David and Dan think that watching Arya do chores for half the season makes for a more riveting narrative. Tyrion and Ser Jorah get captured by slavers who teleport behind them, and it would have been nice if Tyrion's witty nature like the earlier seasons was more intact here. Instead, Brian Cogman writes this scene where they're oddly obsessed with Tyrion's magical dwarf cock, which is quite the sentence, and apparently, cock merchants exist. So, when you're writing dialogue in a fictitious show, the possibilities are endless. And when you decide to write the scene in this manner, it just simply comes across as baffling when you can come up with a much more witty solution to this problem. At least the ending is much better, where Tyrion pitches Ser Jorah as a great fighter.
You haven't had to use that axe of yours in a long time. I hope you remember how.
I remember how.
Here we go. Time for more Dorne. So firstly, I think it's absurdly stupid that Jaime has no plan and admits he's just improvising.
Once we've got the princess, then what?
I like to improvise.
That explains the golden hand.
Do you honestly think you're funny?
Which, when the threat of war rides on this mission's failure, you'd think that coming up with a tangible plan that doesn't also get yourself killed would be a pretty major priority. Like, at the very least, if you're trying to pull off a mission of this nature, then doing it at night under the cover of darkness would be an absolute given. But Jaime and Bronn go during the middle of the day and assault Prince Trystane out in the open in the Water Gardens with Myrcella. Good thing there weren't any witnesses around, how convenient. This is just mind-bogglingly insane in terms of their expectations of success, and I'd never want Brian Cogman to be the mastermind of any kind of heist. Period. Then this is also ignoring the fact that their uniforms they stole have massive holes in them given that they were impaled by swords. And they should also be drenched in blood and not just a tiny splash as shown on Bronn. Then there's also the issue of Jaime and Bronn not looking like proper Dornish people, and they're not even wearing their face masks to cover up that fact. Like, are there any guards anywhere in the Water Gardens? Can anyone simply just walk in and kill Trystane or Myrcella? What is happening? How did this make it through production without anyone questioning this insanely dumb script? Then it doesn't even stop there, because coincidentally, Elia Martell sends the Sand Snakes to kill Myrcella at the exact time Jaime arrives. This moment has the same energy as Euron Greyjoy swimming ashore right as Jaime happens to walk by. The chances of this happening at the same time are so inconceivably impossible that it's making my brain bleed trying to process this script. And you'd also have the same question as to why Elia Martell is blatantly attacking Myrcella out in the open midday while she's with Trystane. Why not wait until she's asleep and pacify the guards or something? I don't know. It's also revealed in episode 9 that Elia had Myrcella's necklace stolen from her room. So if she's able to infiltrate it, then why not also abduct or kill her? That seems like the most logical approach, but hey, we wouldn't have this absolutely atrocious action scene to jack up the ratings because our fans love action and not any semblance of logical storytelling. Then the action in question is so terrible that almost every single beat in this scene is plagued with contrivances. Like Tyene utterly failing to kill Bronn while his sword is sheathed, Nymeria whipping at Jaime, and then once she leaves frame she disappears from the scene, Obara twirling her spear around, graciously giving Jaime enough time to unsheath his sword, Nymeria finally reappearing 10 seconds later, who instead of whipping and grabbing someone's leg, thus incapacitating them, chooses to just poke at Bronn with her whip, and then just a bunch of miscellaneous silly choreography beats. Then Nymeria opts to steal Myrcella, which is immediately confusing to me because I thought their whole objective was starting a war, and killing her would be the easiest and quickest way to do that. Taking her hostage would just force Dorne to solve the conflict himself. However, this doesn't matter because, hey look, the guards who have been missing this entire time have finally woken up from their writer-induced naps that all coincided at the same time. Also, if Brian Cogman makes it to where the Water Gardens are barren of any witnesses, then who even alerted the guards in the first place? God, this scene feels like a clown endlessly pulling handkerchiefs out of a hat. It's just non-stop egregious writing flaws. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the scene devolved into Obara pulling out an AK-47 and laying everyone out. Then luckily, the tracking chip that Dorne installed into Elia's skull activates and alerts the guards to her location. Obara also tries to incite a revolution, and the only reason I can think of as to why no one complies is that they don't want to deal with this absolute godlike chat of a warrior. Because once he's dead, everyone decides it's revolting time. Olenna arrives at King's Landing and delivers my favorite moment of the season.
Oh, you can smell the shit from 5 miles away.
And this may not be a devoid of logic aspect for season 5, but I think it's hilarious how David and Dan drastically changed the landscape surrounding King's Landing. From here, we have the inquiry of Loras Tyrell, and everything is mostly fine until the actual evidence comes out where his former squire knows what the birthmark on his thigh looks like. This could be so easily countered by Loras making up a story like, I don't know, he took a shit in the woods, and while his pants were down, his squire saw his birthmark. The fact that everyone treats this as irrefutable proof is pretty absurd, and Loras instantly lashing out essentially seals his fate. I guess his reaction is realistic since it's driven by emotion instead of logical thought, but literally, no one in the room tries to present a counter-argument to prove Loras' innocence. Isn't that kind of the point of this scene?
He's a liar.
And what is your counter-argument or evidence?
Olenna is supposed to be one of the smartest, quickest, and sharpest players in Westeros, and she sits in her chair as if she's stun-locked. Then we finally have the wedding and the unfortunate rape of Sansa. This is probably the most uncomfortable moment in the entire show, and after thinking about it some more, I question whether we really needed to see this. Because at this point, the audience is already terrified of Ramsay given his time with Theon, and the following episodes establish the relationship between Ramsay and Sansa as being pretty toxic. So going so far as to have a rape scene with a minor feels like a bit much, even for Game of Thrones. Especially since, as I said, the scene doesn't have much to offer narratively that doesn't come off as redundant, and it's purely just for shock value. I feel like a more suitable ending would be, as Theon closes the door, the camera is on the other side of it, and when it shuts, it cuts to black, insinuating that a rape occurs and we don't actually have to sit through it. At the very least though, we get a great performance from Alfie Allen. Jesus Christ, episode 6 took up a massive chunk of this video. Hopefully the following episodes are better. Episode 7 is directed by Miguel Sapochnik, and there's a noticeable quality shift, at least for the directing. And to break conventions for this video, I actually want to point out a clever moment in this episode, which is Miguel fooling the audience into thinking that Theon is going to light the candle in the broken tower. He does this by playing triumphant music and Theon scaling a tower, but he actually stumbles into Ramsay's chambers to rat on Sansa. Genuinely a solid moment, and now, let's get back to losing brain cells because that's obviously more fun. In relation to this plot point, the thing that puzzles me is how they figured out the identity of the person who helped Sansa. All Theon knows is that she's getting help and doesn't know from whom. So Ramsay instantly figuring out who it is with seemingly no investigation is definitely a choice for the writing. Also, given that Ramsay now has this information, I think it would make sense to either send troops to the location where Brienne is waiting, or bait her by lighting the candle and drawing out whatever her plan is. Instead, Ramsay leaves this be and allows this potential escape opportunity to still exist. Realistically, Brienne would probably get screwed over here, but hey, those are actual consequences that David and Dan don't even conceive of. Then we have the start of the painfully annoying and tragic downfall of Stannis Baratheon. On one hand, the situation the writers put Stannis in plays out partially logically in that it makes sense he gets defeated, but on the other, writing it to where a character is ultimately defeated by bad weather is a crazy writing decision. This entire arc has been built up for multiple seasons, and the job of the writers is crafting a logical and also exciting story. Nothing about this story direction breathes any kind of aspect of entertainment, and it's baffling to me that David and Dan think this is a satisfying arc. Imagine if Jon Snow succumbed to the same fate. It would be absolute dog shit, and the same applies to Stannis Baratheon, a literal POV character since season 2. Then there's also the whole contrived angle of the subplot in which Stannis for some reason wants to commit to a losing position. His reasoning here is that he doesn't want to become the king who ran. But I mean, like, who the hell is going to judge him? He's bleeding troops, his supplies are completely cut off, and the weather has turned his position into an unwinnable conundrum. I feel like the writers are forcing Stannis to argue on their behalf for their own justifications because it feels inherently contradictory character-wise, since Stannis is supposed to be one of the smartest military minds. And I don't know if anyone else forgot, but Stannis literally has the backing of the motherfucking Iron Bank of Bravos. I'm sure they'd understand his situation and keep funding him if they believed in his cause. Hell, Cersei is doing a terrible job in King's Landing, and there is no way she's repaying any of her debts at this point in the story, especially since she's alienating the Tyrells. Stannis, despite being in a temporary bad position, is still the Iron Bank's best shot at recouping their investments and bringing stability to the realm. However, David and Dan treat their involvement in this plotline as a non-factor, and I guess they gave Stannis a one-time investment. It's a real-time nerf, and overall, making it to where Stannis is defeated in such a contrived manner, while also purely through an external fashion, has to be one of the most anticlimactic moments in the show. I'll go into further detail when I inevitably get there, but yeah, this entire arc is complete garbage in terms of writing. Sam the Slayer has a nice scene of defending Gilly, albeit it's pretty convenient he walks in right when they start harassing her. It would have been a little awkward if it was like 10 minutes later, and I guess Gilly hit her life alert button that notified Sam. Then I find it even funnier that Ghost also shows up to save Sam. However, this moment is even more confusing since Ghost is supposed to be locked up in a cage in the courtyard, let alone Ghost being allowed to roam around the castle indoors. I know Jon Snow is now the Lord Commander, so he doesn't have to lock Ghost away anymore, but A, he's not around currently, so Sir Alistair would probably lock Ghost up, and B, I guess Ghost has gotten much better at opening doors. And I definitely need to clean my eyes out after rewatching Sam and Gilly's sex scene.
Oh my.
Tyrion beats up a random guy to try to make himself more appealing to buy, and I guess this pirate doesn't care anymore about the price of Tyrion's magical Lannister cock. So he lets him go because the story fundamentally wouldn't work if this didn't happen. Daario is horny, Tommen is horny, Myrcella is horny, Olenna the High Sparrow would definitely be fucking if he didn't casually arrest Sir Loras, and unsurprisingly, the Sand Snake scene for this episode is very bad. I've always been confused as to why Tyene cares about saving Bronn's life in this scene, especially given the fact that Bronn has insulted her on multiple occasions.
Dornish women are the most beautiful women in the world.
Thank you.
I said Dornish women. I didn't say you.
But hey, Bronn is a fan favorite character and he can't die. David and Dan have great things planned for him. He has one of the best arcs in season 8 that plays a crucial role in the story. Killing him would be terrible for the story, unlike Sir Barristan. Dany hates the sight of dead innocents, which is pretty rich considering what happens later on, and Ser Jorah comes roaring back into the story. It is pretty convenient that Dany happens to choose the one minor fighting pit with Ser Jorah in it, but I'll allow it. Also, I'm not sure why this random dude lets Tyrion go. At the end of episode 7, Cersei's betrayed by the High Sparrow. And while I may have the benefit of hindsight, I think Cersei is pretty daft for not thinking this could end up poorly for her. And the reason why I think this is, at the beginning of the season, Lancel flat out threatened Cersei with the information that they had sex.
I tempted you into our unnatural relations. And of course, there was the king.
And it also happens that Lancel is with the Faith Militant. So I feel like Cersei should at the very least be hesitant that this could come back up again.
Ready to dole out mercy or justice.
Okay.
Also, some of her dialogue scenes with the High Sparrow indicate a darker undertone that she doesn't pick up on.
All sinners are equal before the gods.
Like, I find it weird how Cersei can see right through Marjorie, but when it comes to the High Sparrow, she isn't able to pick up on his fake friendly facade. At the end of the day, this isn't a major deal since Cersei's blinded by her hatred for Marjorie, and I just find it overly reckless that she doesn't at least expect this as a potential outcome. It's time for the biggest draw of season 5, episode 8, Hardhome. This episode opens with Tyrion convincing Dany to allow him to be her advisor, and I always felt like this was pretty rushed and rather frictionless. He does make a compelling case, but Tyrion doesn't actually prove himself to Dany to really justify a place within her inner circle.
Here we sit. Two terrible children of two terrible fathers.
I'm terrible.
She immediately trusts him, which feels out of character for Dany given the amount of betrayal she's gone through and assassins that have tried to kill her. That and he's directly one of her perceivable enemies. For all she knows, Tyrion can simply be lying, and I find it really silly that she instantly accepts his counsel. Then the rest of the scene, Tyrion essentially makes an argument for why she should re-accept Ser Jorah, and then ultimately decides to send him away, which felt a little weird, and I feel like the main reason why this happened was because David and Dan thought it would be better to have a real character in the fighting pits next episode to make that scene more captivating. Arya finally has something to do 8 episodes into this season, there are some surprisingly good dialogue scenes, and the rest of the scenes leading up to Hardhome are mostly okay. And before I'm whipped through the streets for pointing out flaws in Hardhome, I think this is a very good action set piece that's especially carried by its surprising nature. However, this doesn't mean it's exempt from any writing flaws, so let's go into them. Initially, upon going into this rewatch, I thought it was very unrealistic how Jon was able to save so many free folk in a short amount of time and with like a few rowboats. But this wide shot reveals that there are dozens of them, and they are also docking at different places. So I don't think this is actually an issue and is believable since an unspecified amount of time passes after the general meeting. The main issue in Hardhome, though, is Jon Snow's blatant plot armor, and that's exemplified the most through his fight with the White Walker. Before their fight, the Thenn who engaged the White Walker first was killed instantly, so surely the White Walker will give Jon the same treatment. So in this fight scene, Jon should have died 3 times. First was when the White Walker could have simply stabbed him in the back, but instead opted to throw him away. The second was Jon getting thrown against a wall, and the White Walker choosing to not follow up with an attack and allowing Jon to run away. And the third was when Jon's weapon gets shattered, and instead of breaking the weapon back to the left and impaling him, the White Walker chooses to knock him down again. This is one of my most hated tropes in action scenes where the antagonist can easily kill the protagonist, but they instead just toss them around. It's the pure embodiment of plot armor, and it's very unfortunate that Miguel Sapochnik couldn't give us a more compelling scene with realistic fighting choreography. Because that's definitely possible, even though it is revealed that White Walkers seem to have super strength of sorts. Although that doesn't really come back up again. This is the only major point in the scene that bothers me, and there are some small nitpicks here and there, but we don't have to go into all of them. Episode 9 opens with the writers raw-dogging Stannis, and this moment of Sir Alistair letting Jon back through the gate kind of confounds me, given that Jon has ships, and I don't know why they didn't go to Eastwatch. Like, Jon knows that Sir Alistair hates him, and he's running the risk of allowing him the opportunity to screw him over by not letting him through the wall. I'm sure Sir Alistair was also confused by them showing up at the wall, that he didn't even plan for this to occur, so he just let them in. We're also blessed to have more Dorne scenes in this episode, and by far the craziest thing that happens here is Dorne not punishing Elia. He is a very soft guy who preaches mercy, but at the very least, given her continued blatant hatred and rebellious attitude, she should be exiled from Dorne. She's causing so much trouble for Dorne and is basically saying she's going to continue doing so. She does submit to him later, but like, she's obviously lying. So her receiving zero consequences for her actions is pretty baffling. The Sand Snakes have riveting development, Bronn gets bonked, Mace Tyrell continues to be a Chad,
so give me a kiss by the lawn,
and Arya cuckles and oysters around Braavos. While doing this, she spots Meryn Trant and follows him all day, and eventually they end up in a brothel. Which, if you're being followed by a lady selling oysters all day, then it's probably safe to assume that you're being followed. That, and it's pretty ridiculous that she's able to snoop around in this brothel selling oysters, since people apparently really like oysters when they're horny.
They say oysters get the juices flowing.
Oh my god. Bloody hell. Man.
There's a reason I have 5 kids.
To me, the opposite would be true, but I guess the people of Braavos are built differently. Oh look, the oyster girl even followed us into our private room. That's not suspicious at all. Maybe we should question her. Oh wait, sorry. The horniness in the air is just giving me an unquestionable desire to eat oysters, to the point where I won't question anything in my surroundings. After this, we have the controversial burning of Shireen Baratheon. I think this is a very effective scene that elicits strong and guttural performances from every actor that in turn makes you teary-eyed. However, I think the execution here fundamentally compromises Stannis as a character. It's kind of up to debate about whether or not he can be pushed this far into killing his own daughter, but we have to consider what Stannis has said before this event. His biggest point of reasoning for not retreating is that he doesn't want to be viewed as the king who ran. But simultaneously, he's okay with being the king who kills his daughter in cold blood because he's a religious maniac and thinks this will grant him some kind of advantage. Like, I don't know, that just doesn't add up to me. That and David and Dan essentially hide the build up to this decision and instead opt for this to be a surprise for the audience. This in turn hurts the story even more because it makes the twist for his character not make sense from our perspective. If David and Dan really wanted this plot point to happen, then I think Stannis needs to have no part in this. Either make it to where Melisandre goes rogue and does this without his consent, or he's swept away by his crazy religious followers and they mutiny and take Shireen hostage and burn her. Both of those directions seem a lot more plausible than Stannis being okay with killing his only daughter, along with those directions having more interesting avenues for conflict. We're also acting like there aren't 2 scenes in which he wholeheartedly loves her in this season. This essentially does the opposite for building up to a point where Stannis wants to kill her.
Because you did not belong across the world with the bloody stone man. You are the Princess Shireen of House Baratheon, and you are my daughter.
Looking back at those scenes now, it feels like David and Dan are trying to manipulate the audience into loving this father and daughter dynamic so that it would be even more crushing when Stannis betrays her. Then he has to be pretty obtuse to think that this wouldn't further alienate even more men in his army. Like, they're already leaving and now their leader has lost his mind, so that gives them even more reason to get the hell out of there. So yeah, I can see what David and Dan were trying to achieve, but I think their execution was terrible and they ruined yet another fan favorite character. They're 2 for 2 this season, baby. The last scene for this episode is the Dragon Pit fiasco. The action isn't great, and there are some bonkers moments like Ser Jorah rolling up to someone and delivering a final blow, as his opponent doesn't simply back up and kill him, but the primary issue with this scene is Dany having extremely light security when there's a massive risk of an attack from the Sons of the Harpy. Like earlier, we do have the benefit of hindsight, but Ser Barristan just died a few episodes ago, and her being okay with being surrounded by a bunch of masters who are potentially Sons of the Harpy members is really dumb. I could buy this scene if she had her own private booth, and unfortunately, that's not the case. So, unsurprisingly, an attack from the Sons of the Harpy ensues, and Dany and friends get surrounded in the fighting pits. It probably would have been smarter to go into one of these alleyways so that they can funnel the attackers through a choke point, but they gamble their position by trying to find another way out, and end up getting surrounded. Thankfully, Dany is able to telepathically communicate with Drogon, so he flies in to save the day. I initially meant that as a joke, but that's technically true. David and Dan are insinuating here that Drogon can telepathically sense when his mother is in danger, which does have some potential merit despite it not really being explored. Dragons do have connections with their riders, but I don't know if it's as literal as them having some kind of neurological or telepathic connection, which you can make that be the case, and I would love it if David and Dan would actually develop the more magical mechanics within the show. However, we all know where David and Dan stand on magic, so that's obviously not the case. They pick and choose when it's used within the story at the convenience of when to bail out certain characters. Like, if that was the case, then Drogon probably would have saved Dany from the Dothraki after taking his nap. We're finally at the end of Season 5, and there's a lot to unpack for this episode. Stannis faces the consequences of his stupid actions, Jon's happy that Sam the Slayer is now Sam the Pussy Slayer, and it's time for a very fun and climactic battle between Stannis and the Boltons. Wait, what's that? There's not going to be a great resolution to this plotline, and it's just going to peter out into a wet whimper of a fart? How are David and Dan being paid millions to write this shit? At least Stannis had a great concluding scene with Brienne being the person who kills him, but getting Stannis to this exact point is so extremely implausible that you have to be actively ignoring any kind of logic to see this as being half decent. Firstly, Stannis is out in the open in a terrible position, and they're about to be railed, so him being able to fight all the way to this forest is nothing short of a miracle, along with him somehow being the last man standing. Then there's also the whole aspect of Brienne miraculously finding Stannis on the battlefield, and this is also assuming that she doesn't have to fight through a sea of Boltons to get to him. Oh, and how lucky is it that he's still alive when she finds him, or there being no Boltons around so she can conveniently have a nice chat with him. Like, there are just so many aspects about the scene that are so absurdly dumb, and you have to willfully ignore all the shit to enjoy this scene. Which, it is enjoyable if you're able to see past all of that rubbish. While this is all going down, Theon kills Miranda and escapes with Sansa by jumping off a high wall and into the snow. Now, this is pretty plausible. However, the opening of the episode stated that most of the snow has melted. Even Roose Bolton condemned attacking Stannis because there would be too much snow to traverse.
Not to mention that the snow is so deep we couldn't get an army through to engage them even if we wanted to.
But because of that melting, they were able to swiftly attack his army. So I feel like David and Dan hope the audience forgets about this fact, and realistically, Theon and Sansa would probably break some bones if they were lucky, which would make it pretty hard to run away from a pack of hounds. But it's the heroes, and Brienne's plan all along was putting a bunch of pillow cushions down there to save them from their fall. Back at the house of Gucci, Jaqen knows that Arya was defecting this whole time, and I guess it was a part of his plan for her to follow through with this and to punish her. The execution of said punishment is a little confusing given that when Jaqen, or no one I should say, kills himself, Arya pulls off their faces and finds her own. Which should be physically impossible, and this just comes across as David and Dan injecting more spooky magic bullshit into the story. Or maybe the Faceless Assassins injected Arya with a drug to blind her, and a side effect of that is her tripping balls. David and Dan are obviously wanting to be mysterious, and like always, none of it is really ever explained, which is okay I guess. Arya's overall Season 5 arc feels very sloppily written, and it's as if David and Dan are spinning the plot wheels and are trying to buy themselves time until this ending. Because as we've explored throughout this video, practically nothing happens until episode 8. More cringe permeates from Dorne, and oh, it's pretty convenient that Myrcella succumbs to poison while Jaime was talking to her. It would be kind of awkward if that realistically happened when he wasn't around and he walked in on her corpse, but I'll gladly allow this given that it makes for a great scene. Also, it's really confusing how the poison works since Bronn was poisoned and then an episode later it activated, while for Myrcella, it activates like 10 minutes later. Qyburn says in season 7 that it can take hours or even days, but that doesn't apply to Myrcella unfortunately. Daario crafts a plan in Meereen and Varys is released from his timeout session in the plot corner that David and Dan placed him in. Which, thinking about Varys showing up here, this doesn't make any sense at all. Why did the Unsullied let this random person in, and even if Grey Worm or Missandei granted him access without Tyrion's knowledge, they know that Dany has a fundamental dislike for Varys. Given that, he has sent assassins after her, which she talks about in episode 8.
For 20 years, the Spider oversaw the campaign to find and kill me.
He did what he had to do to survive.
So they'd have to know his identity and importance to plausibly let him in. And surely they didn't let in a random bald dude off the streets for no reason, especially given all the conflict of anyone being a Sons of the Harpy member. That and, if Varys was still wanting to go to Meereen, I'm really surprised that Tyrion beat him there since his journey was pretty chaotic to say the least. I don't think Varys had to deal with pirates and slavers, and the fact that he wasn't already in Meereen by episode 8 essentially means that he's been in plot limbo this whole time. But don't think about all that. It's Tyrion and Varys, everyone's favorite duo that doesn't get ruined from this point on. Drogon just wants to take a nap after hard carrying our heroes, and Dany's tummy starts grumbling, so she goes and looks for food. I'm not sure what she expects to find, maybe a Big Mac hidden under a rock, or she's going to somehow wrestle a goat with her bare hands. But while on this quest, she runs into some Dothraki. And like Drogon, I guess the entire Dothraki horde can communicate telepathically and operate as a hive mind, because one person spots Dany and then everyone comes in to swarm her, which for this scene, it's revealed during her confrontation with Khal Moro that they don't know who she is, so it's pretty stupid that they spend all this energy to capture one girl. It's essentially the same scenario as the scene from Finding Nemo. Also, realistically, you think that at least one person within the Dothraki would recognize Dany, since there's probably some carryover of people from Khal Drogo's group and this one. Somehow, though, no one recognizes her, and the only person who does is one of the wives. So this scene just comes across to me as David and Dan having an excess of money to spend for the budget, so they flamboyantly spend it here by showing us a massive horde of Dothraki, even though it breaks all logic. Cersei has her walk of shame, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's incredible and allows Lena Headey to give an outstanding performance. Then I wish the same could be said about Jon Snow getting killed. You probably thought the scene would survive without anything being wrong with it, but to me, the issue with this scene is Ollie. I briefly went into this problem in my villain ranking, and I think there's a couple of issues with his character. The first one is that Ollie clearly hates the wildlings and is extremely apparent and vocal about this. He confronts both Jon and Samwell in this regard, and even Jon is aware of his inner conflict. So given this blatant hatred, it's really confounding as to why Jon continues to treat Ollie as someone he's close to and wants to foster. This is a very clear future conflict, and I know he probably doesn't think it would end with Ollie killing him, but you'd assume that you'd want to keep your enemies at a distance.
I heard it was best to keep your enemies close.
So that's definitely a perplexing aspect of this whole Ollie-Jon dynamic, and there's one more problem, and that's David and Dan treating Ollie as a background character throughout season 5. He receives practically no character development, and this is essential for someone who is going to be the emotional crutch of the climax of season 5, where the main character dies. Like, that's just absolutely baffling to me from a writing perspective that David and Dan skimp out on developing his character, which through our journey in analyzing season 5's devoid of logic aspects, we've noticed a trend in which David and Dan's writing methods have become very lazy in terms of writing characters, or flat out not including them. And the same thing applies to Ollie here. In terms of the actual death, it's a very strong finale, even though it kind of undercuts the legacy of the show's weight of having permanent deaths. We're finally done, and this is by far my longest video, so thank you for actually making it to the end of this feature-length devoid of logic. I'm sure a Glidus will come along in the year of 2030 and do some piss takes on season 5, but for the time being, you're stuck with me. If you like my silly little opinions, I have more for different movies on Letterboxd. I answer any questions you throw at me on Discord. And if you want to help fund the channel, then I have a Patreon. Thanks to my good old pal Logan Farmer for being the biggest and bestest Patreon in all the realms.